nonfiction authors and books on Book TV. You can see past programs and get our schedules at our websites. And you can join in the conversation on social media sites. Well, the U.S. Senate continues debate today on the immigration bill. The measure would boost border security and workplace enforcement, allow tens of thousands of new high and low-skilled workers into the country, and create a 13-year path to citizenship for the 11 million immigrants in the country illegally. A number of amendments are being negotiated. However, no votes are scheduled. Live now to the U.S. Senate here on C-SPAN 2.
Senate will come to order, and the chaplain, retired Admiral Barry Black, will lead the Senate in prayer.
Let us pray. Eternal Spirit, we trust you to order our steps. Show us your path and teach us to follow you. Lord, guide us by your truth and instruct us with your wisdom. Today, help our senators to give you their challenges as they remember that you have promised to make them more than conquerors. Infuse them with a spirit of peace, and may they find new strength in your gift of quiet confidence. May they trust you above all and through all as you pour into their hearts a greater love for you and humanity. Use us, O God, to bring healing to those in pain, hope to those in despair, and peace to those in war. We pray in your awesome name. Amen.
Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
You drew?
Play ball.
The Majority Leader.
Following my statement, the Republican leader will be recognized. I ask unanimous consent that I be recognized when he completes his statement.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. President, following leader remarks, the Senate will resume consideration of S-744, the Comprehensive Immigration Bill. Following the remarks of Senator McConnell and the reporting of the immigration bill, I ask that I be recognized, but I'm sure that'll be the case anyway. So.
Objection.
The bill need to be reported? Or after I...
Under the previous order, the Senate will resume consideration of S-744, which the clerk will report.
Calendar number 80, S-744, a bill to provide for comprehensive immigration reform and for other purposes.
Mr. President.
The Senator from Nevada.
When Alfredo Castaneda crossed the border from Mexico into the United States 2 decades ago, he didn't climb over a fence. He didn't swim across a river. He didn't fly over the border. He didn't walk through the desert. When Alfredo crossed the border, he was a little boy, 2 years old, perched on his father's shoulders. The choice to leave Mexico wasn't an easy one for Alfredo's father. But the rumble of hunger in his belly and his son's belly convinced Alfredo's dad to leave behind the world he knew for a hopeful, better life in America. He wrote me a letter addressed to me, Here's what he said. I lived in a shack with one wall of my house leaning on my neighbor's. The other three were made of sticks and mud bricks. I wanted to give my family a better life, and so I hear the United States is a land of opportunity. All I want is to have a sliver of that opportunity for my family. And so with my wife by his side and his son on his shoulders, Alfredo's father came to America illegally. Alfredo was a 2-year-old boy, as I've mentioned at the time. Today he's a 23-year-old man who appreciates the privileges that come with life in America. But he's also conscious of the opportunities available only to United States citizens, opportunities that aren't available to him because of his immigration status. When his friends applied for part-time jobs in high school, Alfredo knew he could never work legally. When he was researching a paper for a class, Alfredo was denied a library card because he had no identification. When he filled out an application for his dream school, selecting non-citizen on the online form, Alfredo received an error message in bold red letters that said, non-citizens cannot apply for entry in this institution. Alfredo's life in Nevada bears little in common with the shack of sticks and mud he left behind. And for him, America truly is the land of opportunity his father envisioned. Yet, until recently, Alfredo could not get a Social Security number, a driver's license, or even a full-time job because he is an undocumented immigrant. But that hasn't stopped him from reaching for his dreams. This is what he wrote, in addition to what we've already heard. Quote, my parents constantly reminded me to be a good citizen and volunteer in my community whenever possible. He said it would pay off and would help me acquire citizenship in the future. And I took that to heart. So Alfredo worked hard in high school, really hard. Volunteered at a local hospital, became politically active. He enrolled in the College of Southern Nevada. Since he can't find steady work, it's been difficult for Alfredo to afford tuition while he helps support his family. But he believes things are about to change for the better. Thanks to a directive issued last year by President Obama, Alfredo and 800,000 dreamers, just like him, won't be deported and will be able to work and drive legally. Alfredo's already applied for several jobs and even gotten a few interviews. He looks forward to learning to drive, going back to school, completing his associate's degree, and one day owning a business. But President Obama's directive isn't a permanent answer. The Republican majority in the House of Representatives who voted last week, Mr. President, to resume deportation of outstanding young people just like Alfredo, who were brought to this country through no fault of their own. Remember, this boy got here on his dad's shoulders. And the directive isn't a solution for Alfredo's parents and 10 million people just like them who live in the United States without the proper paperwork. It's more important than ever that Congress pass a permanent fix for this nation's broken immigration system. Alfredo believes in us. He believes we will succeed. He believes we will find the political will to pass common sense, bipartisan immigration reform, and do it now. His letter contained a reminder of what's at stake in this debate. This is what he wrote. It's not just a piece of legislation. That piece of paper holds our dreams, ambitions, and potential in it. Note the absence of quorum.
Clerk will call the roll. Mr. Alexander.
And then set it at 10 o'clock.
Mr. President,
Majority Leader.
I ask unanimous consent the call of the quorum be terminated.
Without objection.
Mr. President, it's my understanding that the immigration bill was reported, so we're on that bill right now. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. And the pending amendment is? It's my
The
understanding.
pending amendment is Grassley number 195.
Yeah.
1195.
1195. Mr. President, in just a brief moment, I'm going to move to table that amendment. But I want everyone to understand that I've talked to Senator Grassley yesterday and told him I was going to do this. And the staffs have been advised this is the case. So my unanimous consent request is that I'm going to move to table Grassley, and I've just done that. But I ask unanimous consent that the vote on the motion to table occur at 10 a.m. and the time following Senator McConnell's remarks be 5 minutes for the opposition and 5 minutes for those supporting the motion to table. And so it may run a little bit after 10, but that's according to how long Senator McConnell speaks.
Is there objection? Without objection.
Mr. President.
Republican Leader.
Mr. President, the Obama economy has been pretty rough on our nation's young people. If you're a teenager looking for work over the summer break, or if you're a high schooler looking for a part-time job after school, well, good luck with that. The unemployment rate for 16 to 19-year-olds is 25%, which is near historic highs. If you're a college graduate, things don't look much brighter. In fact, the unemployment rate for 20 to 24-year-olds is over 13%. And it hardly needs mentioning at this point that many Americans are likely to see their hours cut or their jobs disappear altogether as Obamacare continues to come online. That's because so far we know the President's new health care law will impose about 20,000 pages of onerous regulations, and probably many more than that when all is said and done. Many of these regulations will hit small businesses, which create the majority of new jobs in our country. Many of these regulations will hit part-time workers very hard. For instance, the law punishes businesses if they allow employees to work too many hours. So it's no surprise when we read any one of these numerous stories about companies slashing hours. And it punishes businesses if they dare to give jobs to too many people. So, of course, it will probably lead them to slash jobs or actually limit hiring. I'm sure the Washington Democrats who drafted Obamacare thought they were striking some blow here for quote-unquote fairness with these job-crushing ideas. Well, now the youth of our country are finding out what Democrats' so-called fairness means for them, what it actually means for them. It means smaller paychecks or no paychecks at all. It must seem pretty unfair from where they stand, but it actually gets a lot worse. Many experts predict that Obamacare will also cause health care premiums to skyrocket, especially for younger Americans. Some studies show that young men in particular could see rate increases of 50% or more. Think about that. You work your tail off in high school just to get into a good college. You spend 4 years pulling all-nighters and cramming for finals, all for the privilege of putting on a gown, accepting your degree, and potentially spending who knows how long frantically searching to find work. Then if you're lucky, your hours get cut after you find a job. Or maybe your job gets cut altogether. You get a letter in mail that says, sorry, your premium's going up by double digits. Can't pay the higher premium? Too bad. If you don't, Uncle Sam slaps you with a penalty tax. And for all the talk of subsidies, the studies indicate that these payments from taxpayers might not even make up for the higher costs. Look, I'd be pretty disillusioned if I were in that position, and I think everyone else would as well. Well, it could get worse if Washington Democrats don't start getting serious about working with Republicans on student loans, too. As I mentioned last week, President Obama and Republicans actually agree in broad terms on the way forward for student loan reform. As the President's Secretary of Education told Politico just yesterday, my strong preference, this is the Obama administration Secretary of Education, my strong preference would be for a longer-term solution and not to just keep solving it this year and then next year and then the next year. So it's time for Senate Democrats to stop blocking us from enacting permanent reform because federal rates for new student loans are set to double if we don't act soon. Several Senate Democratic leaders have basically already admitted to the media that they'd rather have a failed bill that can morph into a campaign issue than a signed bill that can help 100% of students. Well, it's time for that to change, and they should assume, you really shouldn't assume younger Americans will be that easily tricked one more time in 2014. These young men and women may be drowning in the Obama economy, but it's not because they're dumb or lazy or apathetic. It's because of policies dreamed up here in Washington during the years of the Obama administration. And as the days go by, these young Americans are discovering just how unfairly Washington Democrats have treated them in the past few years. Now finally, Mr. President, on another matter, we've been discussing on a daily basis whether the Majority Leader will keep the commitment he made at the beginning of the last two Congresses that no rules changes would be made other than by following the rules. In other words, the commitment was, I won't break the rules of the Senate in order to change the rules of the Senate. My friend, the Majority Leader, has made that commitment on two occasions. He made it in January of 2011 for the next two Congresses. We're in the second Congress now. At the beginning of this Congress, we had an extensive discussion about rule changes, after which the vast majority of Senate Republicans supported two rule changes and two standing orders. And in return for those changes that we made, the Majority Leader committed once again that for this Congress, he would not pull the nuclear trigger, as we call it around here, use the nuclear option. In other words, turn the Senate into the House. So the Majority Leader will be confronted with his promise, his commitment, on a daily basis until we understand fully that he intends to keep his commitment to the Senate and to the American people. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved.
I suggest the absolute quorum and time equally divided.
Without objection, the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Well, the Senate continues debating the immigration bill today, the measure boosting border security and workplace enforcement. It also allows tens of thousands of new high and low-skilled workers into the country, creates a 13-year path to citizenship for the 11 million immigrants in the country illegally. A number of amendments being negotiated this morning. Members are considering the Grassley Amendment. In fact, there will be a vote to table the Grassley Amendment dealing with border security. That vote is expected to happen at 10 this morning. Live coverage of the Senate here on C-SPAN 2.
Without objection. Under the previous order, the time until 10 a.m. is equally divided between the proponents and opponents of the motion to table the amendment offered by the senator from Iowa.
I would ask unanimous consent that the proponents be given 5 minutes and the opponents be given 5 minutes.
Without objection.
And then we vote.
Without objection.
Okay. Well, Mr. President, I rise to speak against the amendment offered by my friend and colleague, the ranking member of the Judiciary Committee. What does this amendment do? It's very simple. It says that the 11 million people living in the shadows cannot even get RPI status, the provisional status by which they can work and travel, until the Secretary of Homeland Security says the border is fully secure. Now, we all know that that will take years and years and years. And that is why an amendment very similar to this came up in the Judiciary Committee and was defeated 12-6, with 2 Republicans joining the Democrats in voting against it, Mr. Flake and Mr. Graham, who were part of our so-called Gang of 8. The problem with the amendment is very simple. What do we do for 5-6 years until the border is fully secure? It's going to take a while to do it. We need to bring equipment there. We need to build fences there. We need to do all of the kinds of things that are in our bill. We provide $6.5 billion to build $1 billion worth of border fence, to deploy sensors, fixed towers, radars, drones that will cover the entire border. So what are we telling those 11 million? If you hide successfully from the police, then maybe 5 years from now you can stay here and get the right to work and the right to travel. This clearly would undo the entire theme and structure of the immigration bill that has such bipartisan support that is before us today. And again, let me repeat, as I understand it, it is opposed by all the members of the Gang of 8, the 4 Democrats and the 4 Republicans, for the very reason that it will take years and years till the border is secure. And to wait that long, we'll have millions more come across the borders illegally. The number of illegal immigrants in America will increase. And we may never get to real immigration reform that is needed, so desperately needed by the country. So I would strongly urge that this amendment be defeated. The American people made it resoundingly clear they want us to move forward with immigration reform. in a careful, balanced, and bipartisan way. They want us to secure the border, and they want us to be reasonable about the 11 million who are here and about future immigration so we can grow the American economy. That's what our bill does. This proposal would undo much of that without proposing any real solutions as to what we do before that. It has bipartisan opposition, and I would strongly urge that it be defeated. And I yield the rest of my time to the chairman of our Judiciary Committee, Senator Leahy.
Senator from Vermont.
Mr. President, first I have 6 unanimous consent requests for committees to meet during today's session. Senate approval of the majority and minority leaders, I ask unanimous consent that the request be granted.
Without objection.
Mr. President, this amendment, my friend from Iowa, would significantly delay even the initial registration process for the 11 million undocumented individuals in the country. We believe the pathway to citizenship has to be earned, but it's also got to be attainable. And this would further delay a process that already would take at least 13 years. You know, bringing the 11 million people out of the shadows is not only the right thing to do, it's the best thing to do. It keeps our country safe. We know who's here. We can focus our resources on who poses a threat. It's also necessary. We've been pouring billions of dollars into border security in recent years. We've made enormous progress since the last immigration bills in 2006 and 2007. And this bill takes even more. And I will have to, as I said yesterday on the floor, I'm going to have to oppose this amendment. I yield the floor.
Senator from Iowa.
Yeah. I want to remind my colleagues that we were promised a open and fair process in this legislation. The fact that the majority is moving to table my amendment proves that this so-called open and fair process is a farce. The majority is afraid to have an up or down vote on my amendment. They're apparently afraid to have an open debate and vote on a provision that ensures true border security before legalization, and that's what the people of this country want. They claim to be open to improving the bill, but this motion to table shows that they're not ready to fundamentally change the bill. By tabling my amendment, the majority is stifling progress on this bill. They are refusing to have an amendment process to improve it. This is not the right way to start off on a very important bill. You know, we only do immigration reform once every 25 years, so what's the hurry? Surely we need an amendment process in which true immigration reform can succeed. There's a lesson to be learned from the 1986 legislation that's now the law of the land. Then we legalized first and thought we were going to secure the border later, which we never did. So this amendment is the first of many that will improve the bill and do what the authors of the bill say that they want to do, secure the border, and do what the American people expect us to do. The American people are being asked to accept legalization program, and in exchange for that compassionate approach, they'd be assured that the laws are going to be enforced. But as we read the details of the bill, it's clear that the approach taken is legalize first, enforce later, the same mistake that was made in 1986. My amendment would fundamentally change that. The amendment that is now pending would require the Secretary to certify to Congress that the Secretary has maintained effective control over the entire southern border for at least 6 months before processing applications for legalization. It's a common-sense approach. Border security first, like promised, legalize next. If the bill passes as is, the Secretary only needs to submit 2 plans before processing people through the legalization program. We don't need to pass any more legislation that tells this administration to do a job that's already required of them that they're not doing, because people want laws enforced. Nevertheless, the bill would start legalization even if the strategies that the Secretary submits to Congress are flawed and inadequate. What if this Secretary isn't committed to fencing? What if this Secretary believes that the border is more secure than ever? Well, in fact, the Secretary told the committee she thought the borders were secure. That should concern all of us. Legalization status is more than probation. This RPI status is, in fact, legalization. Once a person gets RPI, they get the freedom to live in the United States. They can travel, work, and benefit from everything our country offers. RPI status is de facto permanent legalization. We all know that it will never be taken away, and people that say that 10 years down the road, if we don't have the border secure, that you can have, that you're going to take back and make these people, classify them as illegal again, that's naive. Given the history of these types of programs, we know it will never end. My amendment improves the trigger and fulfills the wish of the American people. My amendment ensures that the border is secured before one person gets legal status. If we pass this bill as it is, there will be no pressure on this administration or future administrations to secure the border. There will be no push by the legalization advocates to get that job done. We need to work together. We need to secure the border for several reasons, so that we're not back here in the same position 25 years ago saying we made a mistake 25 years ago, like we know now we made a mistake. And we need it to protect our sovereignty and to protect the homeland and improve national security. Under my amendment, the Secretary would have to improve that we have effective control as defined in the bill for 6 months before the applications for registered provisional immigrant status are processed. I agree with at least one of the authors of this bill. If border security title is not improved, this bill doesn't stand a chance of getting to the President. So my amendment is a first and necessary step to fixing this issue. I yield the floor.
Majority Leader.
Mr. President, my dear friend, and we've served here together in Congress for more than 3 decades. I care a great deal about him. He's a fine man, a good legislator. But I think the only criticism I have, he must be reading my speeches, because the speech he just gave is almost a carbon copy to what I've been saying for a long time, that we shouldn't have this 60-vote threshold and everything that the Republicans have created. For him to come now and say we're going to have 50 votes, he should go back and read some of my speeches, which maybe his staff has done. Mr. President, I move to table the Grassley amendment and ask for the yeas and nays on my motion.
Under the previous order, the question occurs on the motion to table Amendment 1195, offered by the Senator from Iowa. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus, Mr. Begich, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Chiesa, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Cowan. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Donnelly. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Flake. Mr. Franken. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mrs. Hagan. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Heitkamp. Mr. Heller. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johans. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Mr. Kane. Mr. King. Mr. Kirk. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Landrieu. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Levin. Mr. Levin. Mr. Manchin. Mr. McCain. Mrs. McCaskill. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Ms. Mikulski. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Nelson. Mr. Paul. Mr. Portman. Mr. Pryor. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island. Mr. Reed of Nevada. Mr. Resch. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott. Mr. Sessions. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Stabenow. Stabenow. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Udall of Colorado. Mr. Udall of New Mexico. Mr. Vitter. Mr. Warner. Ms. Warren. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Begich, Bennett, Blumenthal, Boxer, Cardin, Casey, Coons, Durbin, Franken, Graham, Harkin, Heinrich, Johnson of South Dakota, Leahy, Merkley, Mikulski, Murphy, Murray, Reed of Nevada, Rubio, Sanders, Schatz, Schumer, Stabenow, Warren, Whitehouse, Wyden. Mr. McCain, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Barrasso, Burr, Coburn, Cochran, Collins, Corker, Crapo, Cruz, Enzi, Fisher, Grassley, Hatch, Johans, Johnson of Wisconsin, Paul, Pryor, Roberts, Toomey, Vitter. Mr. Warner, aye. Mr. Cowan, aye. Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mr. Donnelly, aye. Mr. Kirk, no. Mr. Cornyn, no. Mr. McConnell, no. Mr. Baucus, aye. Mr. Kane, aye. Mr. Chambliss, no. Mr. Thune, no. Mr. Chiesa, Mr. Chiesa, no. Mr. Tester, aye. Mr. Brown, aye. Mr. Flake, aye. Mr. Isaacson, no. Mr. Udall of Colorado, no. Mr. Udall of New Mexico, aye. Mr. Udall of Colorado, aye. Mr. Bozeman, no. Mr. Menendez, aye. Mr. Nelson, aye. Mr. Carper, aye. Ms. Hirono, aye. Mr. Hoven, no. Ms. Cantwell, aye. Mr. Heller, no. Mr. Coates, no. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, aye. Ms. Landrieu, aye. Mr. Scott, no. Mr. Rockefeller, aye. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Mr. Levin, aye. Mr. Risch, no. Mr. Lee, no. Mrs. Hagan, aye. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. Blunt, aye. Mr. Blunt, no. Mr. Inhofe, no. Mr. Manchin, no. Mr. Sessions, no. Ms. Heitkamp, aye. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Moran, no. Mr. King, aye. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Mr. Wicker, no. Mr. Portman, no. Mr. Shelby, no. Mr. Alexander, no. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Mrs. McCaskill, aye. Just Miss Ayotte, no.